All right, so thank you for all of you who are here today. We're gonna be talking about the new book from Ira Nadel, Singapore Flings. So Ira is a professor of English at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and he's also been the author of biographies of Leonard Cohen, Tom Stopper, David Marmot, and Philip Roth. So he's also published on Joyce, Pound, and Stein. So he's actually coming out with a new book, a new study titled Love and Russian Literature from Benjamin to Woolf. And he actually spent several months teaching at NTU in Singapore, where Kevin teaches. So Kevin's teaching world literature, travel writing, and theater, right? I'm sure I got that right. And he's also the author of Modernist Circumnavigations and the editor of the recent Tales of an Eastern Port. So in 2018, he co-founded the Modernist Studies in the Asian Research Network as well. So I'm gonna be passing the time over to both of them, who are gonna be having a quick, nice discussion about the new book that Ira has written.
Okay, there it is. I can dodge the auto background a little bit. Thank you, Vanessa, and to Epigram for hosting this today and giving me an opportunity to talk to a passing colleague and an old friend, Ira Nadel, about this work. Yes, for those assembled, I'll ask a few questions and try to get this conversation going to hear from the author himself before handing it over to any questions you all might have late in the session. So if you want to put those in the chat, or just make a note of those, there will be that awkward moment where I hand it to the people. But first, Ira, you are a bit of a literary traveler yourself. You have written all these books, this one about some literary travelers to Singapore. So could you open with just telling us a little bit about your own encounter in Singapore and why it led to this particular book?
That's a great way to start, Kevin. Thank you. And thank you for hosting this conversation. It's a real pleasure to connect again, even though physically there's a bit of a distance between the two of us. Well, I've been interested in Singapore for quite some time before I had the opportunity of physically arriving and teaching. And it's the history that fascinated me because it's such an intersection of so many different cultures and literatures and, of course, personalities. And we could talk about political personalities, literary personalities, painters, architects, etc. And in some ways, Singapore seems to me to have benefited and suffered from the imposition of these external cultures that, in a way, have left a footprint. And one of the ways in which I like to measure the different places that I have been fortunate in visiting is to look at the writers, particularly the figures who also traveled to be at that particular point in time. And so I started to look about to see if there was some sort of record, formal or informal, or some form of narrative about the multiple writers who had occasion not simply to visit, but to write about, to stay a bit of time in Singapore. And to my great shock, to my great surprise, I found there was nothing providing a kind of systematic account of these literary travelers, literary visitors. And I researched the topic both at NTU, at the National Library, spoke to some writers, trying to say or ask, tell me, give me a reference book, which would just outline, even casually, some sense of who came, what their response was, and what did they write about. And so in the absence of finding such a book, I thought, well, maybe if I had enough opportunity and time to sit down and see if I could construct that story. So in a way, the book came about because of the absence of this particular text that I had in mind that frankly I wanted to read while I was there and in a sense to take, with me when I left. So as those things happened, I sat down and put something together. And then the issue was, who are you going to include? And what kind of range of people? And that's difficult. That's a hard thing to do.
And you've collected 21. I was just doing the math here. Not my strong suit of these writers, and I know you've had to leave some off as well, that you've told me about on the side. But you've made a lot of discoveries here. Before getting to a couple of these particular stories, I was just wondering a little bit about your organizational principle in tracking these writers down and how you've shared them with us. So the subtitle of the book, for those of you who don't have it in front of you yet, is From Chekhov to Tagore, which provides one form of range of who these writers are, but that is neither the chronological range nor the alphabetical range, which is how the book is actually constructed. So it's such an interesting cast of characters. Can you talk a little bit about how they fit together in your head and how we encounter them now in this collection?
Okay, very good. So the single explanation for the principle about the book is surprise. Surprise, because I discovered as I was researching this general topic, a surprising range of people. You can list, and probably most literary students in Singapore could mention the 5 or 6 writers, foreign international writers, without blinking an eye, whether it's Somerset Maugham or Joseph Conrad or Noel Coward. But I was really quite surprised to discover Chekhov, Hermann Hesse. What was he doing in Singapore? I had no idea. Was he lost? That might have been the proper title, Lost in Singapore. And then you do the same thing with 21 writers. Anthony Burgess, I had an idea he was in the neighborhood, but it was discovery and it was surprise. And then once I realized or saw possibly a sentence that referred to Chekhov being in Singapore, I had to find out more. And so I began to kind of combine a biographical, cultural reading of the experiences of these people. And it wasn't so much what they did while they were in Singapore. That's kind of chronological, and that's kind of, a calendar. Tuesday, we went to the Botanical Gardens. But what was the impact? What did it mean to them? And what did they carry away with them? And often that carrying away took the form of autobiography, took the form of travel narratives, took the form of fiction, took the form of poetry in the case of, say, Neruda. So it was a evolving kind of structural principle. I didn't approach this by saying, well, I'm going to do an alphabetical listing of people. I mean, the ideal book to have been written would have been some gigantic multi-volume encyclopedia where every entry was probably 25,000 words or 50,000 words. But that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to provide a kind of survey of the surprising number of international writers or other figures. Charlie Chaplin is clearly not a writer, but yet he wrote about his experiences in Singapore. And that's a different perspective. And I think that's the second thing. I wanted to provide as many alternate perspectives on the experience of Singapore as possible, so that you find, Isabel Bird, a late Victorian traveler, you find Charlie Chaplin, you find people who haven't even reached adulthood in Singapore, and I'm thinking of Tom Stoppard. But Stoppard's a very important figure, I think, and one of the ironies is that Stoppard never really wrote about Singapore. He didn't include Singapore in any of his plays, to my knowledge, nor even in essays, or even in his early attempts at fiction, because he did publish one novel. So it's a combination of surprise and then diversity in terms of the response and reaction. I didn't want to limit it. I wanted to make it as international, or I guess the buzzword is transnational as possible. And when I started to put together the list of people, it really surprised me. With just one other quick little irony is the belief that a writer had been there and people documented that visit, but in fact the truth was the writer never went there, and that's Ernest Hemingway, because Hemingway's footprint is about various locations in Singapore, but he never went. It was Martha Gellhorn who went.
Um, Great. Yeah, I think the cast, as you say, and I'm attracted to some of the less expected too. So I think you've transmitted some of your writerly surprise to your reader as well. And I think expectations, even as someone who's lived in Singapore for some time, I kind of expect the cast of characters from the UK, especially pre-colonial period. But some of your writers here are later, as well as Neruda and Tagore and Chekhov, which gives us this kind of portrait of world literature that we might not quite expect. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to turn to Singapore, the other kind of major character here. But before I do, I'd just like to maybe take a deep dive into one or maybe two of these chapters. For you to say a little bit more about what they look like. You brought up Chekhov first. Maybe that would be a one to tell us a little bit more of the story. But for someone picking up this book, what kinds of stories of their both being here and taking something with them? How does that feel for a reader when looking at any one of these 21 characters?
Well, I think one of the things that happens is the initial surprise that Chekhov went to Singapore. And one of the things that interested me was, where is the person coming from and where are they going? And in the case of Chekhov, it's Siberia, because he is fulfilling his role as a physician, as a doctor, and he goes to this bleak, dismal, distant Siberian prison camp of some size, and studies the health and behavior of the prisoners. And of course, there were men and women there. There were even small families being formed. And he writes a very dramatic account of that experience. I mean, when he gets back to Russia. But he traveled in two different directions, and he avoided Singapore going, but he came to Singapore on the return. And I think his own surprise and sense of discovery of what Singapore was about at that particular time is something which the reader, I hope, also discovers, because it seems so unexpected. If you mention Chekhov, people will say, oh, he was a playwright, right? And didn't he do The Three Sisters and The Seagull and The Cherry Orchard? Because that's all we know about him, and that's what we studied. And yet this is in literally another dimension of this major Russian dramatist. And also, it's part of his life that we tend to forget, and that is Chekhov the doctor. And he took being a physician very seriously and was deeply committed to helping people, which is his impulse initially to go to Siberia to see what were the conditions. And then this report he wrote, which is a very extensive report, in English is about 300, 400 pages, had an impact on public health policies and on the treatment of these prisoners who were sent to this area. And there are wonderful little details in that report, which I did read. And one of them was, I think his phrase is something like a bench in a park poetry, because people would carve poems on the wooden benches of the camp to their friends or to their lovers or to themselves. But there wasn't really paper and there weren't pens to write things down, but they have these tools, maybe a knife, maybe a broken fork, and they would write the poetry literally on the benches. It's a marvelous detail. That's a detail about language, about ideas, about poetry. So that was something which appears in the report. But Singapore was again, I keep using this word, it was a discovery for him. He had never been in a world like that. He had never experienced a climate like, Singapore. And you can imagine the distinction between Siberia and Singapore is a little bit of a change. And it's a long sea journey. And then he writes a lot about that whole experience. He doesn't forget Singapore. That's what's important. I don't think any of these writers that I selected ever forgot their time in Singapore, whether it was a year or more, maybe like Neruda being the consul general, or maybe it was 5 days, or someone like Charlie Chaplin went, 3 or 4 times, visiting, and it was always a great celebration of the actor and everything else. So I guess what I'm trying to do is express what they discovered through my effort to have discovered them. That makes sense.
Absolutely. And as promised, I will turn to perhaps a minor character, perhaps the most major of all, being Singapore here. For a lot of these travelers, this was as even your introduction points out, Singapore came to be a stand-in for many things. For some of these characters, yes, including Joseph Conrad on first arrival, this is the quote unquote East or the Orient, and suddenly this one port city is carrying the heavy load of all of those expectations. At the same time, many of these travelers are stopping on in Hong Kong or in Yokohama, and all of these port cities from the 19th to the 20th century have this kind of similar character and flavor. What did you find you perhaps in comparison to Hong Kong and Yokohama, if you want to take that on, but what did these writers find to be unique about Singapore, or why did it hold a kind of surprise that maybe some similar places on the circuit did not?
Well, I think there's several things. One is they all come with expectations and anticipations, and it's the cliche of the East, and it's the idea of mystery, and it's concepts, I'm not suggesting right or wrong, but pre-formulated ideas of what the Orient should be like. And then when they get there, they discover something which is a correction or a change or the unexpected. And so this idea of both fantasy and, I would say, danger emerges. The fantasy goes through a revision and a correction. And this idea of danger takes different forms. It's not tigers, but it's social behavior and personal distractions and personal prejudices. And I think this comes out so clearly and repeatedly in Somerset Maugham. His stories, every time I go back to them, I find more and more fascinating because he unmasks the mythology from the perspective of the British traveler in particular and of the colonial. He remakes that through the kind of social relationships and discoveries that go on. There's always something which I find in a Somerset Maugham story which is uncovered. He's uncovering something. And what he's uncovering, I think, is the cliche, is the prefixed notion of what the East is about. And I think that that's really very important. Whereas other writers don't quite take that on, and they don't do it in the same way. Although another writer who does it, but quite differently, that I include is Jan Morris, the travel writer, because she is also uncovering and seeing different aspects, mostly through history, not necessarily through social experience. And in a way, literally educating the reader in ways that contradict the initial archetype of what life must be like there. I think both Somerset Maugham and Jan Morris, and a number of the others, work at this process of if you will, remaking what the anticipated view might be. I put Somerset Maugham in particular, and I wish I had more time to delve into his personality as to what led him to constantly uncover the nature of these relationships, which, kind of originate in England, and then the male goes out there and he has a different set of experiences. Then he might go back to England and come back with his wife. Now he's married, but the wife discovers that he's got this entirely other family that he's had for years there, and then the response to that knowledge. That's one of the very interesting things. Whereas Noel Coward's approach doesn't delve into that. He doesn't really want to know that story per se. He wants to use the setting of Southeast Asia for other purposes. And his approach is completely different than, say, a Somerset Maugham. And one more I have to mention, because he's sort of one of my favorite characters in this, is J.G. Farrell and his novel, The Singapore Trip, which I find it's an encyclopedic account of that period, roughly, 1937, 1939 to 45. And it's romantic in some ways, but it's also anti-romantic in other ways. And I think what I like about the book and Farrell's experiences there has to do with the way he historicizes his experiences. That's what the book is about, and it's part, if you looked at that chapter, it's about the 3 books or so he was doing about the kind of deconstruction of the British Empire. But I think it's very effective.
Yeah, with both Morris and Farrell, you mentioned the kind of historical angle, and in your first response, you said that that's what drew you from afar to think about Singapore. I was wondering, one of my great deceptions here was in the table of contents of Isabel Bird's first, which I took to be chronological, but it's also alphabetical.
Yes.
But I was wondering,
that's very clever, very good.
As you, both while here and while writing from afar, were thinking about Singapore. Singapore itself is, of course, many different places, especially over time.
Yes.
And I was wondering what you made and what your own kind of education in Singapore history was, and how a 19th century version, an early 20th, and a late 20th are very different places. What did you learn about this place's past and maybe its present?
Well, that's a giant question. I mean, really. I mean, the 19th century view is terrifically colonial and enclosed and prescriptive. In other words, this is the way we're going to treat people in Singapore. We're going to build those cathedrals. We're going to have the cricket club. We're going to have the race course, And so there isn't much sense of an indigenous identity. There is not. And then, of course, as the 19th century changes and shifts, and Singapore's profile and its energy begins to coalesce, that initial colonial view is being challenged and certainly being remade. And it's writers like perhaps Conrad, to a certain extent, and Kipling. Well, Kipling is transitional. He's still back very much in the colonial period, but it's someone like Somerset Maugham, again, I have to come back to him, that's beginning to unravel the prescribed view of Singapore in, say, from 1819 up until, say, 1900, okay, to pick a date. But not to sound too essentialist about it, but just to give it some shape. Post 1900, and certainly as you move into the mid and then late 20th century, something else changes, and that is the nationalism, the new constructed identity, the sort of reshaping of Singapore, separating itself from the Commonwealth and from Malaysia, the move I talk about in the introduction from the India office to the colonial office. These are significant moments in terms of the history of the country. And I think today, and what I took away from it, is this extraordinary multicultural country where people, it's a terrible generalization, work with each other, sometimes successfully, sometimes maybe not so successfully, but there's a directness and acceptance, I think, of the multicultural dimension in terms of literature, in terms of social action, in terms of behavior that differs from these other two periods we've been talking about. I'd have to spend more time, and I want to spend more time there to get a sense of it. I mean, but just the languages that, flourish there is something that you do not see in a lot of other countries. Yes, Canada is bilingual, but frankly, living on the west coast of Canada, you hear, almost no French unless you listen to the CBC French radio station or television station. But if we go to Toronto or we go to Montreal, yes, there is a very visible French presence, and naturally in Quebec. But there seems to be something different in Singapore. I don't want to start talking about postmodern civilizations or cultures, but there is something to that which I think is unique. And again, it's unique partly because the size of the country is small, very small. And yet this is operating, it's working. And it's something I think you sense the moment you arrive. When you hit the airport, this is a different experience. And I find it a very positive, a very healthy, a very stimulating experience to have this kind of exposure to the multiple cultures that are all functioning, okay, in their particular way.
Great. I have a kind of more or less perhaps list-like question to ask you, and then I will gently start to see if there are questions from the floor. I can certainly fill our time, but I'll point to you all if whether in the chat or if you want to come on video, if you would like to ask Ira anything. But first, I'll ask you the following. You mentioned Singapore Grip by name, and I agree that
Yes.
it's a really revelatory and rich kind of book in all of its complications. I was wondering along the way of reading up on all of these writers writing on Singapore, are there other recommendations that you'd have? Are there, if you had to put together a, being a teacher yourself as well, I need to do a week and put together 3 readings, is it a Malm story? Is it Youth by Conrad? What might be some of the first things that you would recommend to someone as the supplementary reading to Singapore Flings?
Supplementary reading for the course, which is worth extra credit. Yes. Yeah. Well, I certainly would include Conrad. I mean, absolutely, because Conrad's visits to and from, which were repeated, as you know very, very well, in your very fine collection or edition that just came out. Singapore is a pivot, I think, in Conrad's, not just his stories, but his life. And there are so many experiences that he has there as a seaman that are, in a way, instrumental in terms of how he treats and how he represents not so much Singapore directly, but there's an example of the impact and the consequence of Singapore on his writing. Sometimes it may only be sentences in a short story, but sometimes it could be the focus of, a portion of a novel. And I think Conrad is absolutely, prime figure in any effort to try and create a literary constellation of Singapore. We obviously cannot do a complete encyclopedia, but it strikes me that he is certainly one of the critical people. Again, I would mention Chekhov because it's unusual. Chekhov stands out because he doesn't belong there, but he was there and he wrote about it. That's why I would put an emphasis on Chekhov. And then again, if say you were teaching something about Chekhov in Singapore or Chekhov in Southeast Asia, you want to put it into his larger context. How did he respond to to Chekhov, to Singapore? Can you see something about his reading of Singapore in his later work, in his dramas, etc., or in his personal life? So again, Chekhov to me seems to be a critical person. I also like Martha Gellhorn as a journalist's perspective on Singapore. She went there during the Second World War, just as the Second World War was kind of involved, not the obviously not the invasion, but the post period and so forth. But she brings to it several things. She brings a female journalist's perspective. She feels distanced from Singapore socially. She doesn't feel particularly a part of Singapore on her first trip. On the second trip, she feels, I like this. This is okay. These people have a certain social form of social behavior that I can accept and I can identify with. Now, this is a little bit post-Hemingway, but she gives a very interesting perspective on it. She's uncomfortable in Singapore, which is what makes her writing interesting. All right, where some of these other writers, oh, they embrace it immediately because it is different and has meaning. But it's the writers who feel a little displaced, like Pablo Neruda, who bring a sharper vision, you might say, to the experience of Singapore at the particular times they're there. Neruda's poetry is very interesting about Singapore, as is Hermann Hesse's Singapore Dream and that collection of stories. And Hesse, we haven't mentioned him, but his response to Singapore is this combination of the spiritual and nature. And what I liked about the Hermann Hesse experience there were butterflies. He was fascinated by butterflies before Nabokov. And so his reaction to the butterfly population, and he writes about them, and he writes essays about butterflies, is really quite different. So it's more of a slightly naturalist's response, but his whole time in Southeast Asia is much more spiritual. And that's really what initiated his trip in the beginning. So you see, each one of these writers has a different perspective, obviously, but a different reaction to their experiences in Singapore. And that's another thing I wanted to emphasize. There's no consistency here. They all imagine a different kind of world, which frequently corrects the anticipated, perhaps prejudicial view of what Singapore life might be like. And that's obvious in someone like Alec Waugh or some of the other writers I cite in the introduction, who come with the heavy baggage of Victorian colonialism. And they're just, they're out of step.
Great, thank you. Anyone from the audience would like to chime in?
Yes. What is the oldest book that you have been using, or the text that you have used? From what period is that?
Oh, well, they're from really for the history, I start from the beginning. But in terms of materials that I'm talking about here, it's from about the 1880s right through to, well, I suppose, what, 2005,
Maybe it interests
2005.
you that there is older material. There is another Russian
Well, all
author.
sorts of,
There's another Russian
yes,
author who went to
that's
Singapore in 1856, and that's Goncharov,
yes,
the writer
yes,
of
of course. That's the book I'm going to do next, which is going to precede this book, you see. I mean, you have to stop and start somewhere. Then you have to construct your mental geography, so to speak. And my interest is principally the 20th century, 21st century. And so I wanted to start a little bit before. That's the whole point with with what's her name, Isabella Bird, but to go through the major figures, the major writers who had these writerly responses to their experiences in Singapore. Oh, I mean, there's so many more people I could have included and wanted to include, but it just for, you know, the length of the book and the nature of what we're doing here, it just wasn't possible. I could do this entire book again and make it much less readable and much more academic. I didn't want to do that. That was not my purpose. But
No, I
there are some,
I
yeah,
wouldn't mean.
yeah,
But I mean, there are other
there's,
authors who have visited Singapore before what you mentioned.
absolutely, absolutely. That's why I say I have to write the prequel, not the sequel. And that's what I wanted to do.
Mhm.
Great. We have a question in the chat from Shreya Sharma. I was curious about the context of Tagore's visit and his observations of the country.
Okay, Tagore is a mystery in some ways. He came with an outsized reputation and a sense of adulation. And he was traveling, I think, initially to Japan and then was coming back. And his response is, I think, a careful response. In other words, he recognizes the celebration surrounding his visit. And I think he was very circumspect. He was not as candid as some of the other writers I talk about. He understood, I believe, the importance of his being there and the kind, again, of spiritual quality to his presence. And so it's a very careful reaction to Singapore. Singapore, on the other hand, was just cheerleading and crowds of people and, you know, hanging on every word. And he did some interviews and the press just couldn't get enough of him. But it's quite different than, say, well, Kipling when he went, or Andre Malraux. He had different circumstances that brought Malraux to Singapore. And in those examples, Singapore becomes a kind of launching pad for certain types of imaginative writings. I'm thinking of Andre Malraux and Anti-Memoir, his account of his experiences, not only in Singapore, but through, you know, his travels in Southeast Asia. So every figure has a different, I almost want to say metaphorically, they're carrying a different suitcase. And the suitcase contains different aspects of both their past and their present. But most importantly, I think they take the suitcase with them when they leave. And it's what's in that suitcase and what they do with it in terms of their memories, their reactions. Many took, you know, souvenirs, curios with them, religious and non-religious, and then how they apply that experience to their writings, both imaginative and nonfiction. So I think it's very hard to do generalizations because of the variety of these individuals, which is another thing I tried to do. I certainly didn't want to do just people from Britain, just people from North America, just people from Australia or whatever. It had to be, like Singapore, this kind of composite of a whole variety of types and of individuals: journalists, novelists, poets, travelers.
So is Malraux included in your book? The French
Sorry,
author,
could you repeat?
you mentioned Malraux.
Yes.
Yes, he's included.
Yes, he is.
No, that's what I can
Yeah,
say.
Geert was asking if Malraux has a chapter in the book, and I believe he does.
Because you mentioned Marot, so but I was
Yes.
not sure it was included in the book or not. Yes, okay.
Oh, yes. Yes. I have a long reading list. This book is only the beginning. It's just the beginning. I had to cut down the bibliography. And there's another way of reading this book, and that is you have a little notebook and you copy down the titles, all the titles of the individual figures that I talked about. It's I think quite a varied reading list. I would imagine I'd love to see, let's say, the National Library of Singapore, some sort of display where the actual books, whether by Isabel Bird or by Jan Morris or by Paul Theroux, were actually there so that then people could check them out. And you can match up the way I'm narrating the experience of these writers against what they actually wrote. I think it would be a wonderful exercise. If only to take one writer and to do that kind of matchup, I think it would be quite fascinating. They're also different. And the experiences are so varied. What about Jean Cocteau? And Kevin knows a lot about Jean Cocteau in his travels around the world. And his stop in Singapore was part of this around the world journey that he was on. And he comes with, again, a certain vision of what Singapore should be like and what he wants to do. And then he has these experiences that, Kevin, you could speak to Cocteau in Singapore. What's your take on him in Singapore?
Well, like a lot of his other stops on his world trip, he's particularly interested in opium and brothels. And so
Yes, right.
I think there's a sense in which these travelers, sometimes seeking it out and sometimes falling upon it, also look for, sometimes these shiny veneers, whether colonial architecture or the postmodern architecture of today. And some also look for various forms of vice, both historically and closer to the present. We haven't mentioned Paul Theroux and Saint Jack yet on perhaps that same.
Yes.
They're much more famous because of the movie, but.
Yes, I mean, but Theroux, he had a love-hate relationship with Singapore, and he didn't particularly like his university experiences, but he was able to translate a lot of that into the narrative, which is Saint Jack, which is, again, a very powerful book. I think one of the really most important accounts of an experience at a particular time by, in this case, an American writer. And it's a very effective book. And so that if you were to do a course on literary Singapore, but not by Singaporean writers, and you had to choose 5 titles, I certainly would include St. Jack as I would Singapore Grip. There's no doubt about that. And I think they still are valuable texts that have a lot to reveal about experiences fictively, that is, through fiction, as any other more contemporary, say, 21st century novel. But there are other people here like Bruce Lockhart, who was a very distinguished diplomat and had amazing experiences in the Russian Revolution, but he comes carrying baggage. And that baggage is pretty heavy and weighted, and he's not particularly open to too many, of the new, you might say, and also true with Alec Waugh, Evelyn Waugh's brother, who goes. But Alec Waugh was a very popular writer. And again, lots of interviews with him in the press, etc. So you see, what I was trying to do is to take both the high and the low in terms of the major figures like a Tagore, Noel Coward, Anthony Burgess, but then match them with other writers who came who are lesser known, but still had a very strong response and reaction to the Singapore experience, which again is multi-layered. We can't just say, gosh, they went to, the art museum or they went to concerts. It's much broader than that. It's walking on the street of the dead. It's eating the food. It's, discovering the dark side of Singapore. And quickly, I mentioned again in the introduction, Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen, who both went there and wrote songs about their time in Singapore, and important songs, and it stayed with them. I guess that's really my principle. Go to Singapore and what stays with you. It's not so much what I'm doing there, it's when I leave. That's my metaphor of the suitcase.
Two questions, if I can jump in and pause myself, that I'll pose at once. One, I'm curious as someone who tries to do literary history myself, about your research process, both how you track down a lot of these writings and a lot of the more minor writings. So the extent to which you were able to draw on archives or collaborate with librarians, which I saw a reference with in the book.
Mhm.
And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, in one of your responses, you mentioned, I could have written an academic book, but I didn't. And as someone who has written for a lot of different registers and audiences, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that and your work with Epigram to position this not as a stuffy book with lots of footnotes, but as something more readable and something that might find a broader and more curious, or a different kind of curious reader.
Well, I think it's very important to reach beyond the classroom in terms of one's writing. I think it's important to reach beyond the conference in one's writing, and I'm not writing to other scholars per se. I like to think that what I write is approachable by anyone who has an interest in writers and certain important locales in the world. It has a lot to do, I think, not so much with the research, but the tone of what you write and the vocabulary that you use. And while theory and theoretical questions are very significant, and again, I try to address some of those in the introduction, I don't want to make this book a theoretical analysis of the representational dimension of Singapore and its status today versus its status, say, in the 19th century. That's, again, a different project. I wanted to provide a kind of cultural narrative of these individual writers who, for one reason or another, Charlie Chaplin came on sort of a promotional tour. Tom Stoppard was born there or not born there, but he was born in the Czech Republic, but grew up briefly in Singapore. Different circumstances, but I want it to be, there are books which are open and there are books which are closed. The closed books are very scholarly. They're written for a very small cadre of people who share the same kind of intense interests. Open books are books that are available for the public to be picked up, to be read at the airport, to be read before you go on a cruise, to be found in the biggest bookstores, okay, in the city, or to be available online. That's my audience, and I've always felt that way. And in my work on biography, I try to do the same thing. I want the book to be read. I don't want the book to just be put on the shelf and forgotten, or just left in the library. And to come to your question about research, it was a whole panoply of archival work, of conversations with people. Very interestingly, I had a wonderful exchange with the Embassy of Chile in Singapore about Pablo Neruda. And they actually had some remarkable documents, and they had printed their own little pamphlet about Neruda in Chile. It's not something you're going to find in a library, but they were wonderful. And they took a very keen interest in my account of Neruda and his time, not just in Singapore, but in Malaya and the whole region. So you don't know what you're going to find when you start. And for me, that's part of the great excitement. Yes, I haunted the National Library when I was there. I found some useful things, some not useful things. I had several archivists help me. And then after I left, I had some people there who were researching for me, particularly with the newspaper accounts and other sorts of things. And in North America, you can find several very good archival collections of material, mostly on the history of Singapore, in different university libraries. You have to search and you have to go. But it's all, to me, very exciting because I never know what I'm going to find. And the famous biographer Robert Caro, who has still been working on his biography of Lyndon Johnson, and wrote the famous biography of Robert Moses, has this great little quip: turn every page. That's his motto: turn every page, because you do not know what you're going to discover. And I've certainly had that experience working on biographies, and even in this particular account of the writers who have traveled to Singapore.
Yes, as far as translations are concerned, I mean, let's take Hermann Hesse. Did you read him in German, or did you only look at translations of foreign authors into English?
It was both. It was both. My German is rusty, but I looked at the German edition of the Singapore Dream, and then I looked at their one or two translations in English. They're not major differences, and I am not, look, that would be the scholarly treatment, to compare the translations and to see that the vocabulary he uses to describe an adjective, say on butterflies in German, is different than what it appears in English. I am not focusing on that. That's something completely different. It's valid, it's important, but I want to give his response to having that kind of encounter. What did it mean to him? That's what I'm interested in. When I write biography, that's what I'm interested in, not what happened. Anyone can locate what happened, that's a chronology. It's what did it mean to the figure, and how did it impact on the creative work, if it's a dramatist or a novelist or a singer like Leonard Cohen, how did it impact on their own creativity and their own sense of imagination?
The one you have included is just one of many stories that he has written about Singapore and Southeast Asia. Why that one and not another one, I wonder.
I'm not quite understanding the question.
Hesse wrote about his trip to Asia, which is about 100 pages.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah. Well, he wrote a lot about Asia and in fiction and so forth, but again, that wasn't my purpose. I could have written half the book on Hermann Hesse in Asia, but that wasn't really the aim. You have to have a very clear sense of purpose, and my purpose was completely different. It was his response and his reaction to Singapore. It wasn't. I wasn't trying to do the bigger subject.
Like he wrote about visiting a Malay theater, going on a ride through Singapore in a rickshaw. And so different stories. I was just wondering, why did you pick out that one, the Singapore Dream?
It was a little more adventurous, a little more anecdotal and dramatic. And, you know, I'm always looking for those little moments that reveal something. Yes.
I'm actually interested because I translated myself Hermann Hesse.
Okay.
And also Goncharov I translated into Dutch because I'm Dutch speaking. But I lived in Singapore for 10 years.
Okay, good.
Excellent. I'm getting the nod of the clock. I'm going to ask a final question to Ira, and then we'll hand it back over to Vanessa to help us wrap things up for today. You've clung to your suitcase and your suitcase metaphor of what you're taking with you. And you've mentioned at several points the other books you could write or the sequels still to come. And I was wondering if there was just something in particular, you know, for one of these chapters or one of these authors, you know, is there a bigger story to tell? Is there something still a bit of an itch to tell a longer version of these stories? And will you sort of come back to Singapore in your writing as well as we hope in person?
Well, yes, I think there's more to say about Noel Coward in Singapore. We haven't really discussed Noel Coward. I think it's very, very easy to be superficial about Noel Coward. I think there's something of much greater substance there. He did some acting on the stage in Singapore, even though it was very brief, I think only 2 nights. He returned frequently. He also had a great kind of adulation as he got older and came back. I certainly would like to look more at and think more about Noel Coward. And I think also Andre Malraux. He's a fascinating figure, and his intellectual and emotional, we haven't really mentioned emotion too much. His emotional reaction to Singapore and to Southeast Asia is very important. And he constructed it very, very carefully in Anti-Memoir. And I think that should be more carefully examined. And I think there would probably be some fascinating material, possibly through some records at the French Embassy and other places. I don't know. That's why I have to come back. There's much, much more to do. So I'm giving everyone notice. I want to come back. That's the story. That's it. I got my suitcase packed.
Perfect. Well, join me in our virtual thank you of Ira for his time. And Vanessa, if you just want to close things up on behalf of Epigram, but thank you, Epigram, for
Yeah, of course. I mean, thanks, Ira and Kevin, for taking the time to take part in this discussion, especially Ira, it's right now it's like 11 p.m. for you, right? I hope
Yes, I'm just going out now. We're just going out. We're just having a party now. A Singapore party.
Of course, of course. I hope you have a really nice night or the rest of the night, get lots of rest. The weekend's coming up. I hope everyone has a great weekend. And
Right.
thank you so much to everyone who took the time to come down here, especially our guest from Belgium. You're living in Belgium now, right? I hope that it's not
I'm just
crazy
visiting
time.
my sons for 1 month. In 1 month, I go back to Thailand.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Hope you guys have enjoyed the session today, and thank you so much for coming. I will link the book in the chat, so if anybody wants to learn more about it or purchase the book, you can feel free to click on the link.
Okay, good. I would.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Right,
Great
thank
fun.
you.
Great fun.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, goodbye, Fritzy.
Bye.
Bye, goodbye. Thank you, Kevin.